What's up, guys? Zervian here. So it's come to my attention that as of now, there really is no comprehensive guide on YouTube for countering the transcendental argument for God. Now, I consider this to be the deadliest weapon currently used by Christian apologists, specifically in the debate sphere, right? Online debate sphere. Guys like Andrew Wilson, Jay Dyer, David Patrick Carey, they've kind of built their online careers utilizing this argument with great success. They will try to funnel every discussion into an internal critique, demanding how can you even make truth claims without a coherent worldview grounded in metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. So you'll see in a lot of these debates, what they'll do is, in their opening statements, which I don't like opening statements in debates. I think it's kind of bullshit. But most debates, they will give you an opening statement, and these guys will, maybe you're showing up to debate some Christian nationalism or whatever the fuck, you think you're going to debate. And then these guys will very quickly go through their entire worldview, incorporating the transcendental argument for God. They'll outline the entire thing very quickly, and then say, you can't even make truth claims, right? And so then the other opponent, they'll give their opening statement, which is, about the topic of the debate. And then when you actually get into the debate, they will find themselves, on the defensive the entire time, while the presuppositionalist tag proponent is just attacking their worldview the entire time. And so it can get very frustrating, and yeah, it's if you're not prepared for it, you're gonna end up looking very, very, very stupid. And it's very easy for them because they just kind of follow like a rehearsed script. They use a lot of big words, philosophical jargon to distract, so that while you're, busy trying to parse their sentences, trying to understand what they're saying, they sneak in all these like unproven assumptions. They will very craftily shift the burden of proof. They'll force you to defend unfamiliar positions, perhaps even positions that you didn't even know you held until like 10 seconds ago. And if you find yourself in that position, you've already fucked up. And I've got some bad news for you. Unless you've got a PhD in philosophy, you're probably about to get destroyed and made to look like one of Andrew Wilson's OnlyFans victims on the whatever podcast. Unless, of course, you watch this video in its entirety, right? This video aims to be the first logically rigorous, well-structured, systematic takedown of the transcendental argument for God. We'll start by analyzing necessary and sufficient conditions, then present TAG, the transcendental argument for God, in formal premise and conclusion form. Now, one thing you will notice, a lot of these guys they're very hesitant to ever formally write it out in a syllogistic form, because once they do that, then it makes it very easy for their opponents to look at it, dissect it, and attack it, notice all the fallacies and stuff. So in many of Jay Dyer's debates, for example, his opponents, Matt Dillahunty, Alex Malpass, PhD, philosophy, they will ask him to present it in a syllogism so they can actually discuss it point by point, and then he will start with premise one, and then he'll just go off on a rabbit trail, and then both he and the opponent will forget what they were even doing at the beginning of it, because they'll begin discussing the rabbit trail, and so he'll never actually formalize it. So that's one problem. But if you actually go through the entire, if you analyze the entire debate, or several of his videos, you will be able to put together the premises and the conclusion of the argument. And, you could find this information online where other people have done it as well. So, yeah, what we're going to go through, we'll dissect each premise, exposing flaws with formal logic, and tackle the best defenses from tag proponents. And we're going to crush all these defenses one by one. And I hope that if you take one thing away from this video, it will be, you should not concede a single premise of the argument to the tag practitioner. You have to be like a fucking asshole is kind of the way you got to approach this. You got to be like Andrew Wilson, essentially. Like if you watch Andrew Wilson debate, you'll notice that he is always on the attack, right? Have you ever seen Andrew Wilson on the defense ever? Probably not. Probably not. He's always on the attack. He's always doing an internal critique of his opponent. And, after watching this video, you're going to be prepared to take the attack to them. You will not let them get away with the shifting of the burden of proof. Like, as you will soon see, every single premise of this, the burden of proof is on the tag proponent, right? To justify their worldview. And they don't justify any of their premises. Not a single one. And so you must make them justify their worldview. Like if you watch some of these old like Sam Harris debates that he's done, he'll just sit there on the first fucking point of the debate and he'll just sit there and just go over it and over it and over it again until the guy like rage quits. And I mean, that's kind of just what you have to do, because if you let them have anything, you're going to lose in the eye of public opinion, right? You're going to be made to look like an idiot unless you're very, very knowledgeable about philosophy. So, let's kick it off with a little video from our boy here, Jay Dyer.
Can we see that? X is the necessary condition of Y. Y, therefore X. Now, granted, I know that no atheist is going to accept that when I plug in God or the preconditions or anything like that, but the structure of the argument is not, my argument is God exists, therefore God exists. Okay, do you see that anywhere in that? Did I ever say, no, God exists because God exists. I presuppose God, therefore God exists. Do you see that?
So he's being a little deceptive here, and the reason why I wanted to show this is because a lot of these tag proponents will introduce the argument this way, usually in like their opening statement or something, to show that quote unquote there's not actually like a fallacy in it. But really, this is just logically equivalent to modus ponens, one of the rules of inference for logic. And while he's correct that this is a logically valid argument, he also correctly points out that no atheist is going to accept it when you plug God into it. And the reason for that is because when you plug God into it, then all of a sudden, while it's still logically valid, it is not logically sound. So what this means is that a logically valid argument is if the premises are true, then the conclusion must follow. But a logically sound argument is the premises are guaranteed to be true, and so the conclusion must follow. So in order to demonstrate that the premises are in fact true, in order for it to be logically sound, you must justify your premises and your evidence for your claims. So that is what he's going to fail to do. And now also you'll notice that another thing he's doing is he's kind of taking he's kind of like straw manning a bit and conflating this argument with another argument for God, which would be like the ontological argument for God. He's saying right here, God exists, therefore God exists. Well, really the ontological argument, it says something along the lines of we can define God as a maximally great being. A being that exists is greater than a being that doesn't exist, therefore God exists. It's kind of like the basic form of it. Now you get way more advanced versions of it, like the modal ontological argument, where you start talking about possible worlds and all that shit. We'll do a separate video on that. It's pretty interesting as well. But for this, and it's also possible that he's just talking about some idiots in the comment section that don't really know what they're talking about as well. So that's also possible. But let's go ahead and continue.
Is that the same as this? No, it's not. There's nothing. It should be self-evident in a way. I don't believe in self-evident truth, but in a limited.
So he had to hedge there because he has to say he doesn't believe in self-evident truth. That's actually one of the counter arguments to the tag argument that we'll go over. It's this idea that you don't have to justify logic because it's an irreducible primary axiom, such that you have to use logic to argue for or against logic. So it's naturally circular. So you can't. It's one of those things that is just self-evidently true because you have to use a thing to prove or disprove the thing. So
It's sense, right? It should be obvious.
That also feeds into like his counter argument against the objection of circularity, which we'll get to at the end of the video, where he says that in order to make a metalogical claim, you have to allow circularity. So that invalidates the that justifies the circularity claim, or the circularity of the tag argument is what he'll try to argue later. We'll go over that. We'll debunk that. So
to any reasonable person that this is not a fallacy. If X is a necessary condition of Y, and if Y is the case, then clearly, by necessity, X is the case. It's very simple. Okay? It's not rocket science. I know people get confused over transcendental arguments. They think this is some wild, obtuse, out there thing. It's actually really simple. What's Father Deacon's analogy he always makes? Cake, right? What are the necessary conditions of having a cake? Flour, eggs, sugar, icing. Okay? I have a cake. If I have a cake, then by necessity, I have the necessary conditions of cake: flour, icing, eggs, milk, whatever. I don't know, whatever makes a cake. I don't know. I don't need that. I don't need that soy Pillsbury Doughboy diet that old John Lennox is over there eating. Okay, I eat the carnivore diet.
Hey, carnivore diet's pretty based. I'll have to give him that one.
But if I did eat cakes, then by necessity, the cake would include the necessary elements of cake to have cakeness, namely flour, eggs, milk, sugar, etc., etc., etc. To quote Bernardo from West Side Story. So, do you guys see this? Because I just want a little minute to rant there about the bottom of the barrel IQ stuff going on in the atheist comment sections.
I just wanted to get to that part where he says bottom of the barrel IQ stuff. I love that. That's fucking hilarious. A lot of these tag guys are kind of funny. Like, I disagree with pretty much everything that, almost everything that Andrew Wilson or Jay Dyer say, but they do make me laugh a lot of the time. So, got to give them props for that. Anyways, now we're going to go ahead and go now into a discussion of necessary and sufficient conditions. And I wanted to do this because a lot of people, it's very easy to get confused on this. And if you've ever studied for the LSAT, one of the very common patterns in that, they'll try to word the problems in such a way that you confuse necessary and sufficient conditions. And so I think it's very important we'll just go over this in some detail here. And so everybody is on the same page and fully understands what's being claimed here and how it works together. And by the way, there is going to be some repetition in this video. I think that's good for learning. I'm going to show a lot of these arguments, and then I'm going to kind of go through them again in the symbolic form. So, if you want to sometimes go to 1.5x, or if you feel like you have to skip around or whatever, I'll try to include timestamps. This is going to be a long as fuck video, probably well over 2 hours. So hang with me. Hopefully this is for like the hardcore people. Okay. This is for the fucking hardcore people. So if you're interested in this stuff, hopefully this will be a decent resource for you. And yeah, so let's fucking go. All right, let's hop right into it. So the best way to depict necessary and sufficient conditions is like this, right? Draw a big circle. That's a horrible looking circle, but you can say that X is out here. X is the necessary conditions. And Y, X is a necessary condition for Y. So Y is dependent upon the existence of X for it to exist itself. X is not dependent on Y. Y is only sufficient for X, but not necessary. So you could have other letters in here as well, right? You could have like an L. So X is necessary for L. X is necessary for Y, and it's necessary for L. But L is not necessary for X. It's only sufficient. So you're probably thinking, like, how does this apply to God and the Transcendental Argument and everything? Well, I will show you. I'm just going to redraw the circle because that one was fucking terrible. So let's try that again. Let's see if I can make a little bit better of a circle so that we can do kind of like a bigger one here. So we could say God, G here, big G. And then inside here, we could have something like logic. Something like knowledge. That fucking loser, he's like, Ty Lopez, we're in my garage now. It's not about these Lambos, it's about the knowledge. Right? Yeah, sorry. All right, anyways, Transcendentals. We could just say, all right, whichever version of the tag argument you run into, it's always going to list a few different Transcendentals. Intelligible experience, regularity of induction or experience, ethics, knowledge, logical almost always be in there in some form or another. But you'll know what I'm talking about when we get into the formal premise and conclusion forms. But this is kind of what it'll look like. In order for logic to exist, it needs God. But so logic is not, necessary for God. It's only sufficient. So that's kind of the this is the relationship between the Transcendentals and God. So how would we represent kind of like the X is the necessary condition for Y in kind of like a formal logic form? So it would look something like this. Say like Y implies X. So the arrow, technically speaking, means implies, but you could say like if Y is true, then X must follow. It's another way of saying it. Another way of saying it here is that X is necessary for Y. X is the necessary condition of Y. So like another way to write it is you could do it like this. Y, therefore X. And this is kind of putting it into, I mentioned earlier the modus ponens form, right? Modus ponens looks like this. You go like P, therefore Q. That's modus ponens. Now for any, it's one of the logical rules of inference. Now for any logically valid arguments, you should always be able to take the contrapositive, and the contrapositive should always be true as well. So in the above example, you could say something like not X, therefore, or not X implies not Y. So if you don't have X, there's no way you could have Y because X is necessary for Y to exist, right? X is a necessary condition of Y. And then I guess it's worth mentioning briefly that you could, there's another rule of inference as well related to this called modus tollens, and it goes like this. Not Q, therefore not P. And this little thing right here is, if you haven't caught on, is the not operator in formal logic. If you've done any coding, it's equivalent to the exclamation mark. But okay, so you're probably asking, okay, well, what does all of this have to do necessarily with the transcendental argument? God, like, what else can you, like, what's the problem with this argument? Well, like I said, this is a logically valid argument, but the big challenge here for the tag proponents is you have to demonstrate that God is not only sufficient, but he's necessary, right? He has to be necessary for these transcendentals and not just sufficient. So for example, let's draw another circle here. And we could say able to ground logic. So we could say God is in here. We can say God. So this is kind of the flip side, right? This is what Dyer, Andrew Wilson, all these guys, this is what they have to prove is not possible. That God is not just sufficient for being able to ground logic, not just sufficient for logic, but he is necessary, because you could have another God, right? You could have someone like Krishna, right, from Hinduism. You could have someone like Zeus from Greek mythology. You could have an alien, right, like Q from Star Trek. Maybe he's almost a near omnipotent being in Star Trek. Perhaps he could ground logic in some simulated universe. And you know what? Actually, perhaps it could even be an emergent property. So it's not even a god, it's just an emergent property of a stable universe. So they have to prove that God is not just one of these many different possibilities that's sufficient for being able to ground logic, but he has to be actually necessary for these things. And this is a very tall order. And this is one of the most fundamental problems of the entire transcendental argument for God. So hopefully that'll make sense. And let's go ahead and get on with the next part here. Okay, so let's go ahead and start diving into kind of what the transcendental argument for God is, like kind of the premise and conclusion form. And so I prepared 3 different variations of it, and then I've also got one that we'll actually be going over that's more kind of like robust, I would say, but I wanted to go over, just kind of show you the basic structure real quick. So there's like one that's like the intelligibility variation. If the Christian God does not exist, then the intelligibility of human experience, like rationality, science, morality, cannot be accounted for and leads to self-contradiction. Premise 2, human experience is intelligible and does not lead to self-contradiction. Conclusion, therefore, the Christian God exists as a necessary precondition for intelligibility. And then this is the logic variation. Now, I believe Andrew Wilson, he uses something very similar to this quite a bit. I remember him giving it in the debate he did with Pixie on the Whatever podcast. It's like 4 hours long. Quite good, actually. Quite a solid debate. If God does not exist, then the laws of logic, universal invariant principles cannot be justified or accounted for. The laws of logic exist and are justified as we use them in reasoning. Therefore, God exists as the ground for the laws of logic. And then this is the inductive variation, right? If God does not exist, then the uniformity of nature necessary for scientific induction and causality cannot be justified. Premise 2, the uniformity of nature exists and is justified as science relies on it. Therefore, God exists as the guarantor of uniformity and causality. So this is kind of like the general idea. I wanted to show a couple of the more basic variants of it before I get into the one we're actually going to cover. Now, the one we're actually going to cover is pieced together from a very nice presentation by the channel, the Church of the Eternal Logos, by David Patrick Harry. Link will be in the description. And I put in the timestamps whereby which I acquired each premise and the conclusion. And this is the one that we're going to be covering in this, because it kind of takes all of these and kind of puts everything together really nicely in one argument. So premise 1, certain preconditions or transcendentals, for example, the laws of logic, including non-contradiction, identity, and the excluded middle, induction, morality, language, number theory, the self, space and time, truth, justice, they are necessary for intelligible experience, knowledge, discourse, and ethics. Premise 2, these transcendentals require a coherent metaphysical justification to avoid incoherence or arbitrary assumptions. Premise 3. An atheistic or materialistic worldview relying on matter, chance, evolution, and empirical induction cannot justify these immaterial, invariant transcendentals, leading to self-refutation. For example, using logic to deny metaphysics while presupposing logic. Premise 4. A theistic worldview justifies these transcendentals by rooting them in God's transcendent mind, providing a coherent foundation. And our conclusion, atheism is incoherent and cannot account for the preconditions of experience. Therefore, God must exist as their necessary foundation. So this is the tag argument for God. I don't think anyone can accuse me of strawmanning it. This is pretty much what you're going to hear. You could argue maybe some of these transcendentals aren't necessary, number theory, whatever. But, that's kind of irrelevant because it's really the structure that we're looking for. I think we can at least all agree about the laws of logic. That's always in there, right? The laws of logic one is pretty much always in there. So, and I will, if something is like specific to this argument, I will point that out. I don't want to strawman anything. I want to take on the best possible steelman versions of this. And so let's go ahead. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go premise by premise through this and give my kind of critique of the entire thing. And then afterwards, we're going to go into pretty much like the best objections, by the tag proponent to, kind of like the main arguments about its circularity. One of the main criticisms of the tag argument is circularity, like Jay Dyer and Church of Eternal Logos, they have some interesting kind of like counter arguments to this that if you're not really familiar with philosophy, you're just going to be like completely lost and it's going to be very difficult for you to contend with. So anyways, okay, let's go ahead now and we'll go into the critique section of the video. Okay, so premise 1 says that intelligible experience, knowledge, discourse, and ethics require specific transcendentals, like things like the laws of logic, induction, morality. And symbolically, I guess we could say something like this, right? Premise 1, intelligibility, experience, knowledge, and discourse, and imply transcendentals. So transcendentals are necessary for intelligible experience, knowledge, discourse, and ethics. Now, my critique of this is that it is committing a fallacy of overgeneralization by asserting a specific list of transcendentals, saying that they are necessary without justifying each one. Now, this is not to say that every transcendental argument must have my existing the exact transcendentals that I listed in my argument. I'm not trying to strawman it like that. Where like in the argument that I gave, it lists justice, for instance, as a transcendental. I mean, that's an easy one to strawman, that I could do, but that's not the fucking point. The point is that whichever transcendentals they do list, they have to justify, right? So even like the most fundamental one that is pretty much always going to be on whatever transcendental argument you encounter is the law of non-contradiction. The logical principle stating that contradictory statements cannot both be true. If it were the case that they would both be true, intelligibility is not possible. That's the claim of classical logic, right? But these tag practitioners, they make that claim, but they don't provide any evidence for it. for why, alternative transcendentals could be added, or a fewer transcendentals could potentially suffice. Which ones are absolutely necessary. I would suggest that even the most fundamental ones, like the law of non-contradiction, can in fact be challenged. So in this case, we have the claim of the law of non-contradiction, that it's necessary for intelligible experience. And this gets challenged by an alternative logical system known as paraconsistent logic. This system allows true contradictions without collapsing into incoherence. Now, unlike classical logic, where a contradiction implies everything, this is a principle called explosion. Paraconsistent logic uses a restricted consequence relation to contain these contradictions, enabling coherent reasoning to continue in inconsistent scenarios. You can imagine like a database, server up, server down at the same time type of thing. Let me go ahead and further explain this idea of the concept of explosion, right? So you would draw, I guess you would symbolically represent this as A and not A. And from this, any B must follow. So basically, from a contradiction, any proposition can be proven true. So actually, what we would want to do to make this correct is this is the entailment operator in logic. So I believe this is correct. If A and not A, then it entails that any B can follow. This is the concept called explosion. So how can paraconsistent logic use this idea of restricting consequence relations? So basically, it does it by forcing conclusions only from maximally consistent subsets of the premises. So rather than the entire possibly inconsistent sets, premises are partitioned into maximally consistent fragments. And the level of consistency is measured by the minimal number of such partitions needed. So a conclusion A is forced by a set if for every partitioning into consistent subsets where n is the consistency level, at least one subset classically implies A. And this prevents the explosion because inferences are drawn only from non-contradictory parts, isolating the inconsistency. So for like an example here, we could do like this. Could say like P, and then we could do like not P, and we could do Q. Do a little curly brace thing. This set is inconsistent due to P and not P, but it can be partitioned into consistent subsets like this. So P and Q. And not P. And here, Q follows from the first subset, but not necessarily from the second subset. So depending on the partitioning, arbitrary unrelated statements do not follow from the contradiction involving P. And this makes the This prevents the crazy explosion of incoherence, that comes from the idea of, it comes from having contradictions, basically. It prevents the spread of the craziness. So you're preserving much of the classical reasoning, but you're still able to coherently think through and deal with contradictions. This is very useful in computer science and AI applications, database applications, that kind of stuff. All right, so let me go ahead and let's erase part of this. Oops, wrong button. Still getting used to using this little drawing tablet thing that I got. All right, so the next part here will be going back to the main argument. So another way of formalizing this is that we can say that for all y, so this little upside down A looking thing stands for all. We can say for all y, I, E, K, D implies transcendentals. However, there exists Z where Z represents like alternative systems undermining the necessity of transcendentals. So for example, paraconsistent logic. Also, I forgot to mention there's actually one called intuitionistic logic that gets around using the law of the excluded middle, by the way. Not too familiar with that one, but it is a thing. I can look into that more potentially in a future video. Anyways, so for all alternative systems, intelligible experience, knowledge, and discourse, and system, and not transcendental, right? So there exists a Z where, again, Z represents alternative systems undermining the necessity of transcendentals, where intelligibility, experience, knowledge, and discourse, and, Z again, that are not transcendentals. So the premise claims that if we have intelligible experience, knowledge, and discourse, I hate saying this over and over again, but we have to be very precise here. We must have specific transcendentals like classical logic, right? But there are alternative systems, Z, right, like paraconsistent logic, that allow intelligible experience without those specific transcendentals, like classical logic. For example, paraconsistent logic handles contradictions and still works for reasoning, like we just kind of illustrated how it does it a little bit. So the premise is wrong to assume that only classical logic is necessary, as other options, Z, exist. It overgeneralizes by claiming a specific set T of transcendentals is necessary without ruling out alternatives Z. And so that is kind of my counter argument to premise one. Now, potential objection perhaps might be that paraconsistent logic is niche or less intuitive, but that kind of misses the point, right? The point is that the claim that the law of non-contradiction is necessary and not merely preferred. So, and plus you've got paraconsistent logics, practical applications in AI, databases, etc. prove it supports coherent reasoning, refuting the necessity of God-grounded classical logic. So, the burden of proof is on the tag proponents. They must demonstrate that each listed transcendental, particularly the law of non-contradiction, is uniquely necessary for intelligibility. Paraconsistent logic and other systems shift the burden back, requiring tag to disprove these alternatives to maintain premise one's claim. Now, also, the premise's reliance on induction, the assumption that the future resembles the past, is also quite questionable. So, for example, a Bayesian epistemology, a probabilistic framework for updating beliefs based on evidence, offers an alternative that does not assume absolute regularity. For instance, diagnosing a disease using prior probabilities, something like symptom prevalence and new evidence test results, for example, to update likelihoods supporting knowledge and discourse without requiring a rigid transcendental like induction. So, unlike classical induction, which assumes uniform patterns without accounting for uncertainty, Bayesian epistemology dynamically revises beliefs based on evidence, allowing for probabilistic predictions that adapt to new data, making it a distinct and flexible alternative. So, if you're at all familiar with me, I come from a poker background, and so I am very comfortable with the idea of Bayesian epistemology. I've been involved with a few different mass data analysis teams in poker, that it created strategies. I wasn't involved in actually creating the strategies, but I was, following the strategies on the team. And, basically you would analyze player tendencies over the course of the whole site, and then you determine, how much you want to deviate from what is the game theory optimal play in order to exploit tendencies of opponents to generate more expected value. On any given hand, the data could be wrong, and you get fucked. But overall, as long as the data is correct and the people are actually playing this way, you're going to win money, right? You're going to get that EV. So I'm very comfortable with this way of thinking, making database decisions and not needing any, absolute certainty, right? I'm completely fine with leaning on probability, right? I've done that pretty much my whole life playing poker, so very comfortable with this. All right, so let's go on to premise 2. All right, so premise 2 states basically that transcendentals exist and need a coherent metaphysical justification, an external absolute foundation for abstract entities like logic, in order to avoid being incoherent or arbitrary. So let's update our premise list over here. Let's go to premise 2. So basically, transcendentals imply metaphysical justification. So that is, so you have to have metaphysical justification for your transcendentals, essentially, is premise 2. That's the main idea of it. And premise 2, as it turns out, begs the question, meaning it's circular reasoning. By assuming transcendentals require a metaphysical foundation rather than an epistemic, knowledge-based foundation, or even an axiomatic, self-evident one. So this is what Dyer in that video earlier was hedging against the idea of an axiomatic foundation. So logic, for example, is irreducibly axiomatic. This is the case because arguing for or against logic requires using logic, making it self-evident without needing further justification, because you have to use the thing to argue for the thing, so it's circular by necessity. And any attempt to ground logic, including with God, is circular because it relies on logic to make the case. Arbitrariness can be avoided through a coherent web of beliefs, right? So supported by evidence and falsifiable predictions. Coherent web of beliefs supported by evidence and falsifiable predictions allows you to avoid arbitrariness. We could say over here, if you think about it, like, what is the necessary condition for arbitrary, right? Necessary condition for arbitrary is just simply no reason, right? Actually, let me do it like this. So if you have a reason, then it's not arbitrary, right? That's what must logically follow. So you'll see in a lot of these conversations, I just wanted to point this out because you see in a lot of these conversations that they'll try to say that, like if you're claiming something like, they'll try to say that like your justification, they could keep going back and back, and it becomes like an infinite regress, in your justification cycle. But the thing is, you don't actually. I read this really nice philosophy paper. I can't remember who it was written by, but the guy was actually arguing for infinitism. Funny enough, I'd never seen anybody actually do that before. I'll get the name, put it in the description, but it was very interesting because the guy's like, you don't actually have to provide the full chain of justification, right? You just have to be able to potentially be able to get it, or you have to be able to propose tests, right? Or propose some method by which you could potentially one day get the answer to your question. Whether at some point you're going to end up in like the quantum realm or whatever, and it's going to be really crazy. But you don't have to provide the full chain of justification necessarily to avoid arbitrariness, is the idea of that argument. You just have to get to like that like one level higher if needed of justification, right? So I mean it's an interesting argument, kind of a side note, kind of irrelevant to. I don't want to like distract too much from it, but it's kind of funny. Hopefully I said that right. Hopefully I didn't get anything wrong there. It's possible because I was just kind of ad-libbing that, but you can fact check me in the comments, since I'm sure you guys will. But anyway, so we can avoid arbitrariness through this coherent web of belief supported by evidence and falsifiable predictions, aiming for empirical, synthetic truth, and not just like an analytic truth, like 2 + 2 = 4, which we'll get way more into this here in a moment, because Jay Dyer, he loves bringing up Quine's 2 Dogmas of Empiricism. But as it turns out, he misrepresents the fuck out of that paper. So we'll get into that here momentarily. Now, non-metaphysical justifications, right? So beyond axiomatic logic, coherentism, which is justifying beliefs through their mutual consistency within a system tested empirically to avoid arbitrariness, right? So like one of the problems with coherentism is that you could have this, it's like this idea, it's coherence theory of truth, right? Where, propositions support each other, and as long as they aren't contradictory, then they fit together, within like the web of truth, right? But the problem is that this you can have a similar web that is literally the exact opposite of the chain. The exact contradiction of every single thing. And that is equally consistent and coherent as the other one. So you have to say, well, which one is true? And this is one of the great criticisms of the coherence theory of truth, because these are equally coherent, but only one of them is, going to be true, right? So how do you arrive at this? And well, it turns out that what you can do is you can use evidence, empirical testing, to ground one of your webs in actual evidence that corresponds to reality. So that's kind of how you get around that. So also, you have the idea of like reliabilism, justifying beliefs through processes that consistently produce true beliefs. Like your senses, vision accurately identifying a tree or like a car coming, that type of thing. There are a lot of philosophical debates about, not being able to produce your trust your senses, the whole Descartes' demon, all this shit. I mean, that's another video. That's another video. There's so many branches that this can go. I'll try to stay on topic, guys. I'm sorry. For example, coherentism justifies logic as part of a consistent belief network tested by empirical outcomes, while reliabilism treats logical reasoning as reliable if it consistently produces accurate results in typical environments. So it's kind of like a pragmatic approach, right? Such as reasoning about like, observable patterns. These approaches avoid the premises demand for a metaphysical foundation, so you're kind of undermining its theistic bias. So let's go ahead and we can go into this. So this kind of looks in logic form. So for all transcendentals, this is the claim of the premise. There exists a metaphysical justification such that if transcendental is true, there is a metaphysical justification. And then, however, the counterargument here is there exists an epistemic justification such that transcendentals and epistemic justification and it's not metaphysically justified, right? So there exists another option here, epistemic justification, that can take transcendentals, and by using epistemic justification, it can justify them without a metaphysical justification. There's no need for the metaphysical justification, essentially. So I'll try to explain it a little bit better, but basically, premise says that if transcendentals like logic, the T, we'll say, plug in logic here, exists, they need a metaphysical justification, a foundation in metaphysics. But there are other ways, like down here, the E, epistemic, like coherentism, coherent web of beliefs, found grounded by actual data and evidence, to justify logic, transcendental here, or any transcendental, whatever you're using, in this case, we're talking about logic, without a metaphysical justification. So no metaphysical justification. So coherentism uses a consistent belief system to justify logic. So the premise wrongly assumes that a metaphysical justification is the only option. So it wrongly assumes this because other options are possible. So this is a mistaken assumption here. So let's go ahead and now we're going to go into Quine, good old Quine, Two Dogmas of Empiricism. So this is one that Dyer really likes to misrepresent, and he does it in almost all of his debates. And he says that Quine in this paper comes to the conclusion that he says that Quine rejects empirical justification, right? So in this paper, Quine he's doing a critique on the analytic and synthetic truth distinction. So kind of like going back to Kant had this idea of like analytic truth, which are things that are, you call it analytic truth, true by definition, not to be determined, but true by definition. And then a synthetic truth is, true by experience. So this is like an empirical, scientific claims are true by experience, right? Like it requires like experience in the world. Whereas analytic truths, you just have to like understand the definition of the words or the terms or the symbols to be able to, and it's true based on the meaning of the words and the symbols and the language that you're using, right? Now, Quine's critique focused on the idea of synonymy. So like, you get this idea of like all unmarried men are bachelors. And so this is considered synonymous because you could say like you could swap this out. All bachelors are unmarried men, right? And that works. But Quine's critique, it basically says that because of the way that humans tend to use language, so this kind of goes to the another philosopher named Wittgenstein, right? He has this idea that the meaning of a word is how it's used in the language. So, for example, I like to use the example of the word nuts, right? So there's so many different contexts, definitions for nuts. So like if you're in the context of like a grocery store, it can mean like pistachios or almonds. The context of psychology can mean a crazy person. In the context of physiology, it can mean your testicles. In the context of sex, it can mean you just busted a load. In the context of poker, it could mean the best possible hand on a given street. And also in the context of poker players tend to say, well, this situation was the nuts because it was something really good happened to you that day, right? Because you're used to seeing the nuts is like the best possible hand, so if something good happens, you say this is the nuts. So this is kind of the idea that this is one of the things that makes English language very hard to understand because you have so many different variations of words, so many different meanings based on the sentence. So, kind of like the idea that Quine gives is like, okay, but you cannot always just exchange bachelor and unmarried man Because what happens if it's like a bachelor of arts degree, right? Why the fuck? How did I spell aft? What? All right, let's try that again. Arts. A bachelor of arts degree, right? You can't plug in unmarried man and have it mean the same thing here. And there's also like a flower called like a bachelor buttons. Bachelor buttons. You can't plug in unmarried man in there. So, he gives this critique where there's issue with synonymy, such that you can't really say that, or rather it requires an element of experience to be able to divine the meaning of the contextual meaning of the sentence sometimes, right? So like it requires like kind of like some world experience to be able to understand how certain communities are using certain types of words. That's the best way to put it. So he says that the line between the analytic and synthetic truth distinction is somewhat blurred. Now, I'm sorry, this is getting a little bit off topic, but the point is that this is all very interesting, I'm sure, right? If you've made it this far, it's at least interesting. But so what Dyer says is that the conclusion of the paper was that, Quine decided that you cannot empirically justify, scientific beliefs, but this is actually not the conclusion. Actually, his conclusion of the paper was, in fact, that you could actually justify these things as part of a coherent web of beliefs, revisable based on experience, and this would include actually being able to justify things like logic and math. Logic and math avoid these issues of synonymy, right? Because they are very they're kind of closed systems, right? You're not getting like slang words for different math symbols and stuff like that. So the meanings in like math and logic are, they're very stable. They're not changing. So, and then also, just as part of his like coherent web of beliefs based on evidence of the outside world, he supports his justifying empirical claims through this web of beliefs idea, and it's based on empirical data to justify his coherent web of beliefs. And I'll do a better video on this. This is the conclusion of the paper. This is what his entire argument was building towards, and then Dyer just kind of like cuts that entire part out. Doesn't mention it at all. that he justifies empiricism using the coherence theory. That I kind of been discussing a little bit through this entire premise section. So to get back to the burden of proof, right? So they must prove why only a metaphysical justification is the only thing that's possible. They have to rule out like epistemic or pragmatic alternatives like coherentism or reliabilism. And they can't just use the example that I gave at the beginning, which they will try to do, by the way, saying that you can have a coherent set of beliefs and then you can have a identical one that's just the negation, the contradiction of each of the original, and that is equally coherent. They can't just use that. They have to say why, using the empirical data to ground your coherent web of beliefs is not acceptable. And good luck with that. Why is only metaphysical justification sufficient? You have to be able to prove that epistemic justification is not sufficient. All right, let's go on to premise 3. It's been fun. All right, let's get on to premise 3 here. So, premise 3, we'll start it over here. And it says, an atheistic or materialistic worldview cannot justify immaterial invariant transcendentals, leading to self-refutation. So we can represent this symbolically as atheistic worldview, then no justification can be provided for transcendentals, leading to self-refutation. So critique starts with basically this premise is committing a straw man fallacy by equating atheism with strict materialism and ignoring non-materialistic atheistic views, such as things like panpsychism, which is consciousness as a fundamental property, Platonism, abstract entities exist independently, so like a Platonic realm of forms or whatever. And then you have other guys like Frege, for instance, abstract realism, I think is what he called it. It's like a more specific subset of Platonism where only things necessary for like logic and math and science are exist there. And then you have also idea of idealism, where reality is mind dependent. And also, the premise assumes that transcendentals cannot emerge from natural processes. Yet we have evolutionary epistemology, which is the grounding of knowledge in evolutionary processes, where reliable beliefs like logical reasoning enhance survival. And this grounds logic and morality in adaptive survival mechanisms. For example, logical patterns arise from evolutionary pressures favoring consistent reasoning, similar to how consciousness emerges from neural interactions. Some tag proponents claim God is metaphysically a necessary being, whose existence is required for any reality to sustain transcendentals. Now, this assumes a very specific theological ontology without providing any evidence for it whatsoever. This is begging the question, assuming the truth of a conclusion in your premise. And naturalistic frameworks, like evolutionary epistemology, grounded in empirical processes such as neural pattern formation, provide verifiable alternatives without requiring a necessary being. Tag must show why a divine being is necessarily required, which it fails to do. It commits a fallacy of a false dichotomy by presenting only two options: theism or a failing materialistic atheism, and ignores other atheistic frameworks. And again, like I said before, it strawmans atheism as solely reliant on matter, chance, and evolution, dismissing sophisticated alternatives like abstract realism or evolutionary epistemology. I will clarify later, by the way, why evolutionary epistemology isn't like a strict materialism thing. All right, so let's get into this a bit more. So the first thing I wanted to point out, I'll do it at the top here, is that when you see atheism or atheistic worldview, they are equating it, making it equivalent. This is the logical equivalency symbol to materialism. Okay, so it's a very stripped down version of an atheistic worldview. Let's go ahead and draw down here so we don't, because this will be kind of a long one. But basically, premise states that for all atheistic worldviews, if the atheistic worldview implies materialism and there is no justification for transcendentals, which leads to self-refutation. Okay. Now, however, this is the counter argument, right? There exists atheistic worldview that is not strict materialism and that provides justification for transcendentals. So we can say that, in fact, a atheistic worldview is not necessarily equivalent to materialism. So we could write it out like this. Negation of if atheistic, no justification for transcendentals. So given our argument or counter argument here, atheism is not equivalent to materialism. So we can actually take the logical negation of the premise. And so in order to explain this a bit better, I can say that premise claims, once again, that if an atheistic worldview A exists, it's the same as materialism and cannot justify the transcendentals, leading to self-refutation. But some atheistic views are not materialistic and can justify the transcendentals, like evolutionary epistemology, or Platonism. And this view justifies the logic through, or the idea of evolutionary epistemology justifies logic through evolutionary processes. So the premise is wrong to assume that atheism is only equivalent to materialism and thus always is doomed to failure. So we should go ahead and explain briefly, I guess, also what are emergent properties. Evolutionary epistemology posits that cognitive capacities such as logical reasoning arise from evolutionary processes that favor survival-enhancing traits. These capacities can produce abstract entities, things like logic or various concepts that are not reducible to mere physical interactions. For example, the ability to reason logically may emerge from neural structures, but isn't just quote-unquote matter in motion. It involves complex emergent patterns that transcend simple materialism. So it's kind of the idea that you put a lot of neurons together, they begin interacting in very interesting ways. It's not so easily explainable through strict materialism. Perhaps we're going to see signs of this with AI as it continues to evolve as well. But yeah, so basically what this is kind of saying is that in some cases with things like this, the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts with regard to the interaction of like neurons and things like that. So perhaps properties are emergent when enough neurons are interacting. It's kind of the idea. All right, so we can kind of continue on as well here to the next part of this, which continues. So we can say that for all worldviews, if a worldview implies theistic or Christian theistic, by the way, is what that stands for. Or atheistic and not justification, no justification for Transcendentals. Right, so W is any worldview, implying only theistic or failing atheistic, or So this is referring to up here with atheism being equivalent to materialism, by the way. So it says failing atheistic worldview are the only options. So this is demonstrating the false dichotomy, right? So it's saying that these are the only two options: the Christian theistic worldview or the atheistic materialism worldview. However, there exists a worldview that is not Christian theistic and not failing atheistic, right? Not strictly materialism, atheism, and provides justification for Transcendentals. And so we can say, therefore, the Christian theistic worldview, or, this is the logical or, not a V, atheistic materialistic worldview, and no justification for Transcendentals. We can say that this is false because we have alternatives. So all of this just to demonstrate the false dichotomy, really. It's not really necessary, but we might as well. Yeah, so these are not the only two choices, theistic or atheist materialist, right? There are other options that we've covered. All right, yeah, so like, for example, the Platonism justifies logic, evolutionary epistemology, etc., etc. We went over. So yeah, so this covers premise 3 pretty thoroughly, I would say. So let's go ahead and, did I miss anything? No. Yeah, so they pretty much they have to justify why it's only atheistic materialism or the theistic worldview, and is the only possible options. Or they have to and they have to address why evolutionary epistemology, panpsychism, Platonism, etc. Which, by the way, Jay Dyer, he loves talking about Platonism, so he does have arguments against that. But the point of it is not that any one of these is like necessarily devastating. It's just the fact that because they're making the claim, they have to defend themselves against these things, right? These other alternatives. So they have to justify their premise that they're asserting, right? So good luck with that. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to premise 4 now. Okay, so we are on premise 4 critique now. The theistic worldview, Christian theistic that is, justifies transcendentals by rooting them in God's transcendent mind. So that is the core claim here. Yikes. We'll call that premise 4. We're going to call it TH. That stands for theistic and referring specifically to Christian theistic worldview. This might get a little confusing here in a moment, but I will try to keep it all clarified for everybody. So, if the theistic worldview is true, then we have justification for transcendentals. That is the core claim of premise 4. Of course, again, the full thing was theistic worldview justifies these transcendentals by rooting them in God's transcendent mind, providing a coherent foundation. So, well, the premise commits special pleading, a fallacy where God is exempted from the rules applied to everyone else. It demands that atheism justify transcendentals with a foundation, but gives God a free pass, assuming that his mind grounds them without needing justification itself. The premise assumes God's mind grounds transcendentals without explaining how. It just says God makes it work, offering no clear mechanism. The Euthyphro dilemma highlights this problem. Now, you've probably heard of Euthyphro dilemma. Hopefully I'm saying that right. You've probably heard of this with regard to the moral problem, right? Is it moral because God says it is, or does God say it is because it's moral, right? That's kind of the standard form of this. But we can adapt that argument to this situation as well. In this case, it would be, does God decide what logic is, or is logic independent of God? Does he make non-contradiction true by his will, or is a law of non-contradiction independent of God? If he decides what the rules of logic are, then it could be, it's possible that it may not be invariant. Right? Now, Dags will have a counter-argument to this. We'll get to that momentarily. But, it could be possibly different. Like if he decides to change logic, depending on what mood he is on that day. Now, if it's separate from God, then we don't need God to. He's not actually the one grounding the transcendentals, right? We don't need him to exist for the transcendentals if it's separate from God. So he has to be the one, grounding the logic. It has to be dependent on God. So that's kind of how the Euthyphro dilemma applies in the situation. Now, so this kind of goes back to what we talked about at the beginning. Is God necessary for logic, or is he only sufficient for logic? And so I'm going to give an example here of, an alternative worldview. Going back to actually Christian Gnosticism. So Christian Gnosticism, it's very good at actually explaining like the problem of evil and things like this. Basically, it goes like this. There is a higher realm known as Pleroma. I think also, depending on which variant of Gnosticism, there's also a name for it called like Barbello or Barbellos or something like that, but we'll just go with Pleroma for this video. And there is a being there known as the monad. This is the supreme entity, basically the God, the real omnipotent, true, highest deity, at least that's known, right? And then he has lesser beings known as aeons below him. And one of these aeons was named Sophia. And Sophia wished to... so you had to go through the monad, right, in order to create beings. she went around, she wanted to make something on her own without following the proper procedures. So she created what's known as the demiurge. And she noticed immediately this was a flawed being, and she cast him out. She banished him, the demiurge, from Pleroma, the kind of supreme heavenly realm, whatever you want to call it. And it turns out, actually, that this demiurge is actually the equivalent to the Christian God. So he is cast out. He has no idea that this higher realm exists. He has no idea that he was created by this aeon named Sophia. And, he's a defective being who thinks that he is the true God. He's completely ignorant of the higher realm. And he creates our, imperfect, materialistic universe, our realm that we live in, right? Creates the animals, creates us, the whole story. He's a jealous God that wants to be worshipped. Turns out he's harvesting us for our quote unquote divine sparks. And, this goes, I don't want to get too much into it, but it's pretty interesting shit, to be honest. But the point of my example here is that the demiurge, the Christian God, is grounding logic, right, for our materialistic universe. But he's unaware, actually, that the monad is up there grounding the Transcendentals in the higher realm. And it's possible, actually, that the monad is the one that's actually grounding the Transcendentals for the lower realm as well. And that the demiurge is actually unaware of the activities going on above, that he's not actually the one grounding the logic. But it's possible that the monad is just grounding it in Pleroma, and God, aka the demiurge, is just grounding it in our physical universe here. So the point of all of this is just to say that, with the Christian Gnostic worldview, you potentially have here, you have two entities capable of grounding logic. So God, in this case, would just be sufficient. It would be sufficient for grounding logic, but not necessary for logic or other transcendentals, right? And you can take this a step further as well, like I said earlier about like Q from Star Trek, whatever. I thought this would be more on theme, though, the monad. Pretty good. So moving on, you have the idea of naturalistic emergentism. This shows that transcendentals like logic can arise from natural systems without a divine designer. For example, the brain's neural networks shaped by evolution produce consistent reasoning patterns grounding logic naturally. Logic can also emerge as a property of a stable universe where reliable patterns like causality and uniformity create invariant logical structures. Human reasoning evolves to reflect these universal patterns, connecting our minds to the cosmos. This counters theist claims that logic requires divine grounding, as natural systems provide a basis for both cognitive and universal logic. So some tag proponents claim that God is the ontological ground of all reality, asserting that only a personal and absolute being can sustain transcendentals. By the way, got to be doing a video on ontology soon as well, because people throw that word around all the fucking time, and when I hear people talking about it, I get the feeling that they really don't know what the fuck they're talking about. But moving on. This assumes personhood is necessary without proof. impersonal grounds, like the monad or naturalistic emergentism, where logic arises from natural systems like neural networks, provide ontologically sufficient alternatives. Tag must demonstrate why only a personal God can ground reality, which it fails to do. So let's go ahead and go up here. So kind of what we're doing here. So like the Christian theistic worldview is equivalent to the existence of God. Okay, let's keep that in mind. Very important to keep that in mind. So we can say that for all worldviews, if not Christian theistic, then you must justify for your worldview. That is the essentially the claim of the premise that they say that Christian theistic worldview is justified because God grounds the Transcendentals, but then they're saying that you have to justify your worldview. Well, they're not justifying their worldview. Special pleading demonstration here. So, however, this is the counter argument part. There does, in fact, exist a worldview that is not theistic and does, in fact, provide justification for Transcendentals. And so, non-Christian theistic, right? So you could have something like the monad, you could have fucking Zeus, you could have, whatever. You could also have naturalistic emergentism as well. That's another worldview that's not theistic and provides the justification for the Transcendentals. So, they don't let them get away with special pleading. They have to justify their worldview. Let's see. Did I miss anything here? I'll just go through it one more time. I don't know if I explained it super well, but essentially the premise claims that if theism is true, it justifies Transcendentals, where theism means that God exists. Let's put this right here. It assumes God can justify Transcendentals without needing justification for himself. But they demand that all non-theistic worldviews, non-theistic right here, non-Christian theistic, justify themselves. So, all the other worldviews, like the Gnostic monad, can justify Transcendentals without God, showing God isn't the only option. For example, the monad grounds logic, so the premise unfairly exempts God from needing proof. Let's see. All right, yeah. So and then there's another big issue here, right? Let's go over the next part here. Erase this shit. All right. Okay, let's do this one down here actually, so we have a little bit more space because there's going to be a lot to this one. So let's do if God Then you get justification for Transcendentals, where justification for Transcendentals is equivalent to God. Because you need God to justify your Transcendentals, right? So it logically follows from here. And so the form demonstrating the circularity here will occur here, right? So you have God, therefore, justification for Transcendentals is equivalent to God. So this is really this looks like a fucking 6. I'm so bad at drawing. Whatever. So the next part here is an illustration of the Euthyphro dilemma here. And so this goes like this, right? If transcendentals, then God. And then you have two options, right? You have either this option where it's not if transcendental, then invariant. Jesus, I'm so bad at writing. All right, so if transcendentals are, or if God is necessary for, so if God is necessary for transcendentals, then the transcendentals cannot be invariant because God is controlling them, basically. That's the idea. He could theoretically decide that they could be different. Now, there is a counter argument to this, that the tag practitioners will use, that we'll get to here momentarily, that logic is based on the structure of the mind of God, so God cannot change it because that's how his mind is structured. So that's the counter argument to this. But for other transcendentals, it doesn't really work as well, like justice, for instance, morality, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of problems. Because we have evidence, in the Bible, actually, that he plays a little bit loosey-goosey with the morality from time to time. It's not a set standard necessarily. Sometimes he thinks it's okay to kill kids. Sometimes he thinks it's not okay to kill kids. Just depended on, like what tribe it is, etc. So, but I don't want to get too much into the morality discussion, but you can see how a lot of these transcendentals not necessarily invariant. All right, so then the alternative is that if it's not the case that transcendentals require God, if that is not the case, then it's not the case. It follows that it's not the case that if God, then you have your justification for transcendentals. Oh shit! I put fucking FOF. If God, then justification for transcendentals. So that is not the case. So if God is not necessary for transcendentals, then you don't necessarily have, you can't use God as justification for transcendentals, right? If he's not necessary for them. And so if you don't need God for justification for transcendentals, then this undermines the entire argument. um, so like for the Christian theistic worldview, if you say this is the original claim of the premise, justification for transcendentals, if the theistic worldview is true. I'm sorry. So this is undermined, right? Yeah, this is undermined here, and because of the following facts, right? Either God is not necessary, or he is not invariant, because the transcendentals can change according to his will. So this is why, yeah, this is why the fucking this is why this shit doesn't work, right? So let's go right into. So basically, the premise exempts God from needing justification, which is special pleading, and assumes God grounds transcendentals without proof, which is begging the question, circular reasoning. And it fails to rule out alternative grounds. So, alternative that we've discussed this as well. So, what are some potential objections that might be raised here by defenders of the tag argument? Well, they might claim that monad is just God by a different name, but this ignores, the impersonal, non-Christian nature, which fundamentally differs from tag's theology, and it also completely misses the point of the sufficiency versus necessity argument, right? Because you have to prove that, even if you say that the actual God is the monad, not the demiurge, well, it does appear to be the case that the demiurge is also able to ground logic just as well, or maybe not just as well, but in addition to the monad. I guess it would be just as well, because it's either logic or it's not, right? So he's able to ground logic like the monad can, so he has this ability. So it makes it so God is not necessary for logic. Other beings are capable of grounding it. That's the point. So even a powerful interdimensional alien, Q from Star Trek, he could ground it as well in some simulated universe. So multiple entities could suffice for grounding logic. This undermines Transcendental Argument for God's claim that only the Christian God is required. And also, of course, they are dismissing the naturalistic emergentism as insufficient, but its empirical grounding is seen in observable systems like neural networks, etc. And, we must demand that the tag proponent prove why it fails, not just assume that it does, in fact, fail. Now the other objection would be in reference to the Euthyphro defense, perhaps. They might say that the Transcendentals reflect God's immutable nature, not his will or external truths. This merely shifts the problem, though. Why is God's nature this way and not otherwise? This risks making God's nature arbitrary or requiring further justification, failing to provide the ultimate foundation that the tag argument promises. Some theists invoke divine simplicity. This is what I was talking about earlier, claiming that God's attributes like logic are identical to his unchanging essence, and this is how they avoid arbitrariness. However, don't let him get away with this, because this is assuming a very specific theological framework without giving us justification. Why must God be simple rather than complex? A non-simple entity, like the monad, could ground transcendentals, and divine simplicity risks making logic indistinguishable from other attributes, like goodness or power, undermining coherence. For example, if logic, like the law of non-contradiction, is identical to goodness, how can tag distinguish logical validity from moral value, both of which it claims are distinct transcendentals? This conflation makes the theistic foundation incoherent, as invariant logic requires clear separation from other attributes. Tag must prove why only a simple God suffices, which it fails to do. So you have to show that your mind might be structured logically, and so it's part of your divine essence. But how can you show that something like logic and justice, another transcendental like justice or morality, how can you show that that is structured into his essence in the same way as something like logic is, especially when we do have evidence in the Bible to the contrary? Lots of evidence. Look at that Canaanite slaughter, many others also. The flood. Good times. All right, so they have the burden of proof once again to show that Christian God is the only possible foundation for these transcendentals, and they have to rule out the alternatives. One more word on the problem of induction. One thing that's kind of funny that you'll see a lot of the time is a lot of these tag people, they will bring up this problem of induction, and they will assert that God is able to solve Hume's problem of induction by guaranteeing regularity. Questions like why we can expect the future to resemble the past. Like just because the sun rose today and it rose every day of your entire life, how do you know for sure it's going to rise again tomorrow? If you pick up the pin and you drop it, how do you know it's going to fall to the ground? That type of thing. Like if you pick up the fucking pin, how do you know that an alien didn't fly in, right, with the fucking Death Star and park it right next to the Earth? Death Star is like 4.75 times the size of the Earth, right? So it arrives at the exact second out of hyperspace that you drop the pin, and you notice that all of a sudden the pin just like floats there, and all of a sudden there's like zero gravity. How would God ensure such a regularity whenever this is a law of physics problem, right? The 9.81 meters per second squared that the pin is supposed to fall to the ground was counteracted by the size of the 4.75x the size of the Earth Death Star. And of course, in this situation, you would have much greater things to worry about than the floating pin or Hume's problem of induction, because you've got only a few seconds really before you've got to worry about these gigantic hundreds of kilometer high tidal waves. You got to worry about the atmosphere sucking up towards the Death Star, supersonic winds, massive temperature drops, deformation of the Earth's crust, 10 plus magnitude earthquakes, crazy shit, you're probably going to be dead within like a minute, basically. So that's the least of your problems. But, you know, the point of all that, sorry for the detour there. If there's any physicists, let me know what I got wrong there. But the point of that is that God doesn't really solve the problem of induction, does he? Because he's not really like communicating, sharing his divine knowledge with us, is he? He's not coming down anymore in the burning bush to let us know if our experiment results. You know, he's not communicating the science to us or anything like that. So I would say that in some cases, based on which type of Christian beliefs you hold, God could actually make induction worse, the problem of induction worse. Now, for example, this is, by the way, this stuff is anecdotal. Before I get to the main point, right? You could just put this as like a side note. But if you believe that, like a lot of evangelistic or evangelical Christians, Christian fundamentalists, you know, that type of thing, what they actually believe, that God answers prayer, they have like a personal God, you know, he'll heal you, and you know, they believe shit like you know, the Trump assassin, right? They believe that God guided the bullet around Trump. This leads to a lot of problems. And the reason why I'm putting this aside as an anecdote is because these Eastern Orthodox Christians that primarily use the tag argument, they do not believe in this type of prayer. At least I'm pretty sure. So I'm not strawmanning them. I'm putting this to the side. This is separate from the main argument. But if it's like an evangelical, like that believes this kind of stuff, like the God saved Trump, there's a lot of problems with that as far as like having some kind of objective morality, right? Because what you're saying actually is that God saw that Trump was going to be shot by that bullet, and he made the decision that Donald Trump's life was more important than the firefighter, right? That's actually what's happening there, because maybe Trump is able to do more good in the world than the firefighter was because of his position as president, or potentially being elected as president. So actually, this makes God's morality begin to appear more of like a utilitarian type of morality than like some quote unquote objective standard. So really what we're dealing with here in this example is a trolley cart problem where, you know, you have the bullet is headed for Trump, where God can flip the switch on the train tracks and now the bullet is headed for the firefighter. But it actually gets worse than that, because if God can control the bullet, why didn't he just guide it into the stands? Like God actually chose to hit the firefighter. So what does that say about God's morality, right? Gets real complicated, because like also like if he's answering all these prayers, you know, he's healing, maybe he heals someone of cancer, but the person with, you know, they got healed of cancer or some rare disease, maybe they were an organ donor and they donate their organs and save like 4 people's lives or whatever, because God interfered with that, then the other 4 people fucking died, maybe. You know, that's another trolley cart problem of sorts. So there's all these, once you accept that God can make these, he can interrupt the flow of cause and effect, there's all these crazy moral dilemmas and butterfly effect things that happen. You know, not only that, but you know, if he does have like the cheat codes to the Matrix or whatever, and he's making all these changes, like how can you ever really know for sure or trust your experimental data? You know, if he's doing all these miracles and things, right? So that's just a side note, not necessary to the main argument. Just that if someone does believe in this kind of thing, maybe you can go down that route, but I don't think that I don't think you're going to hear that kind of argument from Jay Dyer or Andrew Wilson. I think for the most part they actually believe that God exists outside of time and space. So he can actually see, God can see the entire timeline of everything from the beginning of the universe to the end of the universe. And so that actually raises a lot of free will determinism issues, right? I'll make a separate video on that. But essentially the timeline's all the way played out. So he's not interfering. He's not interfering with the timeline, right? He's outside of it. I'm actually kind of curious what their views actually are on prayer. I haven't actually looked too hard into it. I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure how prayer would work with that kind of a belief structure. Anyways, let me know in the comments. Moving back to the main thread now after all of those deviations. I know this video is getting long as fuck. Sorry about that. So the problem of induction highlights the lack of rational justification for inferring future events from past experiences, right? So that's really the problem of induction. How can you take your test results and be completely sure that they will be repeatable in the future, and not just an independent event, essentially? Just because something has happened in the past doesn't mean it will continue to do so. Tag claims that God ensures consistent patterns in reality, justifying our expectation of regularity. However, this merely shifts the problem. Why does God's nature or will guarantee this consistency? Both theistic and naturalistic explanations face the same challenges. Neither can prove future regularity without assuming it. If God's will is unchangeable, this assumption is as unproven as assuming natural patterns will persist. If God's will could change, doing things like altering physical laws, our expectation of regularity becomes unreliable, leaving induction unjustified. In contrast, Bayesian reasoning offers a naturalistic solution. It uses past observations, the sun rising consistently, to calculate probabilities for future events without requiring absolute certainty. For example, in weather forecasting, Bayesian methods update predictions based on new data, aligning with observed reality. This undermines Tag's claim that only God can justify induction. Some Tag proponents argue that only God provides absolute certainty for induction, dismissing naturalistic approaches as uncertain. However, absolute certainty is not necessary for reliable knowledge. Bayesian reasoning delivers probabilistic, evidence-based predictions, as seen in scientific successes, like medical diagnoses or climate models. Theistic claims rely on unproven assumptions about God's consistent nature, making them no more reliable than naturalistic alternatives like Bayesian reasoning. So in summary, Bayesian reasoning provides a reliable, evidence-based alternative to divine grounding for induction, justifying our expectations of regularity without assuming an unproven divine creator. All right, let's move on to the conclusion. Okay, guys, we have officially arrived at the conclusion for the Tag argument, so this will be fun. We're getting close. The end is in sight. If you guys are still here by some miracle of sorts. All right, we got the conclusion here. And again, the atheism is incoherent and cannot account for the preconditions of experience. Therefore, God must exist as their necessary foundation. So we could say atheism is incoherent. If atheism is incoherent, then God must exist is the kind of the short version of it. And then I guess the longer version of it, if atheism is incoherent, then you don't have justification for your transcendentals. You don't have justification for your transcendentals. Therefore, God must exist. Therefore, God. Now, as it turns out, this is actually a non sequitur. It does not logically follow. And so let's go ahead and demonstrate that. Well, so there exists a worldview, right, that is not Christian theistic. And, it's not atheist materialist, right? Because remember, they're conflating atheism with materialism. And this worldview also provides justification for transcendentals. Therefore, remember, we got the triangle of dots. It must not be the case that if atheism is incoherent, there is no justification for transcendentals. Therefore, implies God exists, right? God must exist. So this cannot be the case if we have a worldview that is not theistic and not strictly atheist materialist, which we've talked about. Atheism, or I'm sorry, we've talked about the evolutionary epistemology. We've talked about Neoplatonism, panpsychism, all these alternatives. So this is not this is a non sequitur fallacy and does not logically follow. This does not logically follow. So let me just go ahead and kind of go over my little conclusion here that it claims that atheism's incoherence proves God's existence. But like I just said, this commits a non sequitur, and it also begs the question by assuming God to justify the transcendentals and then using transcendentals to prove God. So that's the classic fallacy of the transcendental argument for God. This is the one that you usually hear about right at the beginning, but I've kind of saved it for the end. Right. So you're using God to argue for logic and then using logic to argue for God, that type of thing. So yeah, I mean that's really the long and short of it. So conclusion claims that if atheism is incoherent, meaning it can't justify transcendentals, no justification for transcendentals, then God exists. But there are other worldviews, like I mentioned, Platonism, that are neither theistic nor atheistic, at least atheist materialists, right? And can justify transcendentals. Or just, for example, like Platonism justifies logic, without necessarily a God. Of course, Plato believed in God, but strictly speaking, it's not necessary, if you believe in like a Platonic realm of forms or whatever, you could go with the Frege variation, if you prefer, that I mentioned earlier, the abstract realism. So atheism's failure does not automatically mean God exists. The other options exist. There are other options that are not necessarily, atheistic. So You could have Platonism, you could have idealism, panpsychism, etc. Many options. So let's go ahead now and we'll demonstrate the circularity, which I've already done before earlier, but we'll just go through it one more time. And so basically it goes like this. If God, then we have the justification for transcendentals. And if we have transcendentals, then we have God, because God is necessary for transcendentals. So this is the loop, right? This is the circularity. This is the loop. This is the big loop of the tag. If God, we have justification for transcendentals. If transcendentals, therefore God. That's the classic begging the question, circular reasoning fallacy there. So that's pretty much it for kind of like the main critique. Now I will go over the very interesting defense that Jay Dyer and also Church of the Eternal Logos channel. I always get his name mixed up. David Patrick Harry, I think his name is. Have come up with similar variants of this. They're a little bit different, but pretty much the same idea. And so the way that Dyer, now he hardly ever brings this up, but if pressed with a very good opponent, he will go into this. You can reference his debate with Dr. Alex Malpass. He goes into this. And that's where I heard it. I don't know if I've seen it elsewhere, but he will go into this. But essentially, what he says is he will argue that metalogic, the study of how logical principles are justified, operates at a paradigmatic level, examining foundational presuppositions of entire worldviews. At this metalogical level, he contends that arguments are inherently circular, because justifying foundational principles like logic requires using those same principles or related assumptions. For example, to justify the law of non-contradiction, one must assume its truth to argue coherently. Now, Dyer acknowledges that circular arguments are fallacious in normative logical discourse. Like, he will actually say that if you're arguing about something else, you cannot use circular reasoning like this. He will actually admit this. As it applies to your everyday reasoning or specific deductive arguments, where this type of begging the question, circular reasoning, undermines validity. However, he claims that at the metalogical level, this paradigmatic level, circularity is a feature of worldview level reasoning. So it's not a bug, it is a feature. It is a necessity, bare necessity, right? Where the goal is to compare the coherence of entire systems rather than prove specific propositions in isolation. So maybe example might be Orthodox Christianity versus materialism. And he will draw on, heard him draw on historical examples such as Aristotle's defense of the law of non-contradiction in Metaphysics Book 4, which he interprets as a transcendental argument that assumes the law to refute its denial. He also references Gödel's incompleteness theorems, suggesting that formal systems inherently appeal outside of themselves, analogous to the circularity in metalogical justification. In Dyer's Transcendental Argument for God, the circularity manifests as follows. The existence of the Orthodox Christian God is presupposed to justify the coherence of logical laws. And the coherence of logical laws is used to argue for the necessity of God. He defends this by claiming that only Orthodox Christianity provides a coherent metalogical foundation, while alternatives like materialism and empiricism lead to incoherence. He argues that this circularity is valid because it reflects the nature of paradigmatic reasoning, where all worldviews rely on unprovable presuppositions, and the choice between them is based on their overall coherence. Now, here's my counter argument to that. Unlike general metalogical inquiries, right? Metalogical inquiry, which may involve circularity by using logic to defend logic, like what I mentioned earlier, right? Many people consider logic to be an irreducible primary axiom because in order to argue for or against logic, you have to use logic to make your argument. So it is inherently circular. However, we cannot let Mr. Dyer get away with this, because what he is doing is he is introducing a specific theological claim. The existence of God, in fact. And this claim requires independent justification. It is not what you might call it's not an acceptable circularity. It's not something that is, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not a justified circularity in the sense that you have to use logic to argue for logic. This is a very specific theological claim that's being smuggled in here and trying to use metalogic as the cover for it. We cannot let him get away with this. This claim must be proven before metalogical arguments can proceed. It's not equivalent to assuming logic itself. Like, this is not before you can make a claim about an argument about logic to prove or disprove logic, you'll have to prove the existence of God. I mean, you can kind of think of it as like an order of operations in math, right? You have to solve for God in this case before you can make your metalogical argument using God in that. So we must force him to prove God in order to use God in his metalogical argument, because it's a very specific theological claim. Don't let him sneak that shit in. They'll try it. They will absolutely try it, of course. Alternatives to Dyer's theistic foundation include Quine's view that logical principles are descriptive generalizations from evolutionary processes justified holistically in a revisable web of beliefs where logic contributes to empirical success. We already talked about Dyer misrepresenting that conclusion by Quine from Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Frege's position treats logical laws as mind-independent abstract entities, existing necessarily as brute facts without needing a divine mind. I mentioned that a few times as well. A very small subset of like a Platonic type of idea. Pragmatism, as in Pearson Dewey, justifies logical principles through their practical success in communication and problem solving, treating them as tools for inquiry that prove valid by resolving real-world issues. These avoid circularity by not assuming a theological entity. Dyer's appeal to worldview coherence fails because coherence does not guarantee truth. A system can be internally consistent but false if the foundational assumptions are unjustified. For example, a solipsist worldview, where only the self exists, you're the only mind, everybody else is an NPC, can be coherent but lacks evidence. simply two opposing webs of beliefs. We'll give an example here. Two opposing webs of belief, a geocentric model, an Earth-centered universe, and a heliocentric model, sun-centered, can both be internally consistent with their assumptions, but only one aligns with empirical data. While coherentism alone doesn't resolve this, combining it with good epistemic practices, evidence and falsifiability, error correcting towards the truth. Shout out to Karl Popper, the man, the myth, the legend. Combining it with all right. So again, combining with good epistemic practices, evidence, falsifiability, error correcting toward the truth, making it superior to Dyer's subjective coherence claims. Without an objective criterion for comparing coherence, Dyer's claim that Christianity is uniquely coherent is in fact subjective. Paraconsistent logic, with applications in AI and inconsistent databases, show that reasoning can function without classical laws like non-contradiction. Intuitionistic logic used in mathematics further supports this. These systems challenge Dyer's claim that only God-grounded classical logic ensures intelligibility, exposing his circularity as unnecessary. He's introducing unnecessary circularity here for his metalogical claim. And on top of that, he is misapplying Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Now, I am not a mathematician, but I'm in the computer science realm, But so Gödel's incompleteness theorems, my understanding is that they apply specifically to formal mathematical systems capable of arithmetic, showing they cannot prove all truths or their own consistency within themselves. These theorems do not extend to philosophical or theological reasoning about worldviews, as Gödel himself never applied them in this way. Formal systems are rigid structures with axioms and proofs, where undecidability arises from self-referential phrases, things like, this statement is unprovable. That's quote unquote, this statement is unprovable. Things like that. Anyways, philosophical or theological reasoning, however, uses informal natural language arguments that are not limited to arithmetic or self-contained proofs. Worldviews can incorporate external evidence, revision, and non-formal methods without incompleteness. For example, a theological worldview, like Christianity, can be debated empirically or historically, not proven or disproven like a math theorem. Unlike formal systems, philosophical reasoning can treat logic as axiomatic without requiring an external theistic entity, rendering Dyer's analogy invalid. Positing God doesn't resolve the incompleteness problem, as it remains an external assumption, just like naturalism, offering no unique solution. For example, Gödel's limits apply to all reasoning is like saying a map cannot describe its own creation process, so all navigation requires a divine cartographer. And thus, this concludes our marathon of a YouTube video. If you are still with me here, please do like and subscribe. Let me know what kind of videos you'll make. I've got a long list of things I want to cover. There are a lot of these arguments similar to this that drive me crazy. A lot of these guys, they like using loaded language hypotheticals. So there's probably going to be one involving one of those coming soon. Like how you can deal with a loaded language hypothetical. Something that's designed to basically make you lose the argument if you even try to engage with it at all. Just from optics of, this would be something that comes up a lot in like objective versus subjective morality debates, for example. these type of loaded language hypotheticals. Anyways, I'm probably going to do a video on that very soon. I definitely want to do one on ontology, and actually just many topics of philosophy. I think that's kind of the direction this channel is going to go. If you want to check out my live streams, if you watch me for the poker stuff, I'll usually be playing poker on there while reacting to videos as well at the same time. I kind of got that like ADHD brain thing going on, so I can multitask pretty well. So react to all kinds of different videos, debates, and political content, a little bit of drama content, maybe funny videos, etc. Come hang out, say hi. I'm on Twitch, Zervian, YouTube, Zervian, and hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully this was good. Any mistakes, let me know in the comments. I've tried to be pretty thorough with this, and I think I've caught all the errors, but I did ad-lib some here, so it's possible I said something incorrect at some point, but try to make this as accurate and error-free as possible. So hopefully you all enjoyed it, and thank you very much.